with us in the format of his book, showing in the reverse order, Le Premier 21e siècle, which is a very great book. Why is this book important for our discussion today and in the work that in the European Parliament service and with the other institutions we are doing on the future and the present, but basically in the field of foresight, is because his book is challenging one of the key intuition, one of the key findings of foresight as it is done at EU level between the institution for now 10, 15 years. And this is the fact that among the long-term trends, globalization and the continuation of globalization have never been discussed. We have discussed in the context of foresight the impact of climate change, how far, how big, how can it be mitigated. We have discussed the speed with which power politics are turning more into aggression, geopolitization of trade, weaponization of the internet. But this long-term trend, globalization, has never been put into question. We have said in a few reports that globalization could take a different look in the future, that instead of having exchange of product, globalization could focus in the future on exchanges of services, of data, that the actor of globalization may be different, that the weight of the different actors within the global economy could be different, but globalization was never challenged as a trend that would stay with us. So this is why in this book of Jean-Marie Guéhenno, challenging the idea that globalization is our future and going rather into the direction of asking if the world is not returning into smaller kind of units, less able to cooperate the one with the other, is a great read and a challenge to our collective wisdom. I will introduce Professor Jean-Marie Guillaud as soon as he's able to connect with us, but I leave the floor for a preliminary comment before he can dive deeper down in his work himself to Professor Jean-Marc Coicaud. Professor Coicaud is a professor of law and global affairs at Rutgers School of Law in New Jersey, upstate New York. He's also a visiting professor at Fudan Institute for Advanced Study in Social Science, and also a visiting professor in Chile. As his library is showing, he's really a global scholar and one that for no more than 30 years has worked both as a practitioner and as an observer and as a scholar on the issue of legitimacy and cooperation. So we are very fortunate that Professor Coicaud has accepted to comment a few of the key elements of the work of Jean-Marc Guéhenno today, Le Premier 21e siècle, de la globalisation à l'émiettement du monde. Jean-Marc, welcome here in Brussels in a remote fashion to discuss this very important work on what is not anymore, according to the book, a non-challenge future. Deglobalization may be the name on the game and not only globalization. The floor is yours, Jean-Marc, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. And thank you for the kind invitation. I'm glad to be part of this event, and I'm sure that we're going to solve the technical problem that we're facing with the connection with New York. So Mr. Guéhenno's book is a very rich book, and so in the 7 to 10 minutes that I have been given for my comments, I certainly do not intend to cover all aspects of the book. I will therefore limit myself to identify what I think, at least based on my reading, what I think are some of the key themes of the book, and then I will reflect a bit on them. So I really enjoyed reading the book. It's very well written, as you mentioned, Frank, and it's full of very interesting insights on all kinds of topic. But first and foremost, the book offers a very lucid analysis and diagnosis on the state of the world today at the national and at the international levels. And I see three main related themes at play in the book. The first theme is a philosophical theme. The second theme is a geopolitical theme. And the third one is a political theme. So concerning the philosophical theme, I think that the big idea that Mr. Guéhenno puts forward is the unidimensional character of today's society. He borrows from Herbert Marcuse, the German philosopher, this notion of unidimensionality. And this unidimensional character comes down, I think, to the fact that money and social success are the measure of everything. This is the argument that Mr. Guéhenno puts forward. And the end result of this state of affairs is the spiritual poverty, so to speak, of the world in which we live. Mr. Guéhenno doesn't use the expression spiritual poverty per se, but I think that this is what he has in mind, and this is what he means. The second main theme at work in the book is geopolitical. And here the book explores especially the competition between the United States, China, and Europe. The book describes two-state continents, China and the United States, fighting for preeminence. And at this stage, it is not clear which one is going to prevail. As for Europe, and there is a full chapter on Europe, we are told that it would be a mistake for the European Union to want to follow the Chinese or the American model and want to become a state continent itself. The book stresses that Europe has to find its own way, its own path. The fact that it is made of a variety of countries, all having very strong identities and histories, is both a challenge and an asset. So how to minimize the challenge aspect, so to speak, and how to build on the asset aspect, these are the questions that the book poses concerning Europe. Finally, the third theme analyzed in the book is the political theme. And here, it seems to me that Mr. Guéhenno focuses on one key idea. It is the idea that if we must be worried about the future of democracy, we must also be more worried about the future of society itself. For the future, both the possibility and the sustainability of society are in question. At least this is what Mr. Guéhenno tells us. In fact, the question of the possibility and the sustainability of society is at the center of the book. The book even begins with this issue. And here we are told resolving this issue depends not only on the question of order at the domestic level, but also on the question of order at the international level. The two are links. And more specifically, Mr. Guéhenno sees society and democracy being eroded by three problems. First, it is eroded by individualism, and especially by the inability to reconcile the individual and the collective. In France, in particular, the unraveling of society fuels individualism. Mr. Guéhenno joined us. Second, society is eroded by the erasing of citizenship because of the generalization of the consumer culture. And third, society is eroded by the expansion of the digital economy and culture. The book recognizes, of course, the progress that digital data can bring about and has indeed brought about, but it also stresses the dangers of digital data. In particular, with our excessive reliance on digital data, we could become the co-architect of our own elimination and the captive of a form of voluntary servitude, to quote the 16th century French philosopher Étienne de la Boétie, Montaigne's friend. So as we can see, these three themes, philosophical, geopolitical, and political, and their treatment in the book, amount to a rather lucid but also dark picture of where we are today. In fact, the book's overall conclusion is to say that domestic and international orders tend to face a deficit of legitimacy, and that this puts us in a precarious situation. So, after having addressed the problems we face, Mr. Guéhenno suggests a number of solutions. And here I hope that in the future, Mr. Guéhenno, you will work on a new book and expand on the solutions you allude to in Le Premier 21e siècle. So more work for you, Mr. Guéhenno, for the years ahead. In any case, if I understand Mr. Guéhenno's analysis correctly, three possible directions are suggested for the way forward. First, the book recommends a world of pluralism within and among societies, one that would allow us to escape the dangers of relativism. From my point of view, this poses the question of the compatibility of plurality. More specifically, this poses the following questions: how to identify and implement a legitimate universality, also how to identify and implement a legitimate diversity, and how to balance and connect the two. Second, it seems to me that the book argues that to go beyond unidimensionality, beyond money and social success as the only measure of everything, we must affirm and celebrate the dignity of the various forms or orders of existence. In essence, here, for example, the book stresses that a poor person deserves as much respect as a rich one. And of course, I could not agree more. But what are the implications of this in terms of social and economic policies? For instance, what social and economic policies would help this principle become reality? After all, for decades, in the context of globalization, as Frank mentioned, we have been told that there was no alternative to economic neoliberal policies. So why and how could this be changed for the way forward? And third and finally, the book puts forward the idea of the need to have a variety of systems of legitimacy, domestically and internationally, at the same time, compatible and in competition. This sounds like a very interesting idea, but what does it mean exactly, and how could it work? So, as you can see, this is a very rich book. There is much to think about as we read and analyze it. Therefore, I really hope that you will read it if you haven't done so already. And Mr. Guéhenno, once again, I can only encourage you to begin working on your next book, the sequel of the Premier 21e siècle. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jean-Marc, to have not only filibustered while we were waiting for Professor Guéhenno to join us, but also to put under the spotlight the three dimensions of this work that is at the same time geopolitical, and this is the main reason why it's discussed today, political, because it is about the future of democracy, like previous book of Jean-Marc Guéhenno, but with quite an update since the first book, La fin de la démocratie, but also philosophical. I would add a fourth dimension. There is an underlying economic dimension, of course. Globalization has been not only a political phenomenon, but basically understood, especially in the European Union or the OECD, as an economic phenomenon, the extension never witnessed before of supply chain to many countries that were not part of those supply chain, a new market for investment with foreign direct investment at level never witnessed before, a large part of the world joining in consumer habits of the Western middle class and consuming the same type of goods and services increasingly, and a large part of the global population out of deep poverty. So there is clearly an economic dimension in globalization, and this one is addressed in the book too, because of course such a global economy with unfunctioning institutions or disagreeing member states or an excess of geopolitical conditionality to the exchange is not very sustainable over the long run. And there is across the book, at least as a reader, this fourth line of a threat to the global economy, its functioning, stemming from the crisis of society, the crisis of policy, and the crisis of the member states. But now that as reader, we have started the discussion, very fortunate to have the author of the book, Professor Jean-Marc Coicaud, Professor of Practice at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, also part of Carnegie Corporation, CIPRI, École Normale Supérieure as a board member. Before that, of course, and this is how you're known, an Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping at the time where we had a very dynamic kind of UN with many peacekeeping mission, and a renowned author for the book I mentioned, La fin de la démocratie, that came as a very sobering reading in the time where we were all discussing Fukuyama and the end of history. So what would be the key point you would share with us as the author of this book that is, of course, a challenge for many of our not consider assumption and a collective wisdom?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and apologies for the connectivity issues. It seemed my computer had a sudden allergy to WebEx, but thanks to an iPad, I'm here now. So I was listening to the end of Jean-Marc's presentation and to your own comments, and thinking that, well, 30 years ago, indeed, I was a contrarian. And I think I am still a contrarian. When Francis Fukuyama published his End of History in 1992, so I wrote The End of Democracy, but in its English translation, it became The End of the Nation State, because the French title was just too much to swallow, I think, in the triumphalist mood of the moment in the United States. I did not share that mood, convinced that what we were witnessing with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was a wonderful moment, but it was as much the collapse of an exhausted system as the final victory of the democratic idea. At the time, I saw that the disconnect between globalization, the word had not yet been invented, that disconnect would undermine democracy. whose consolidation had been closely linked to the consolidation of the nation state. Now, having spent, as you mentioned, my life in the peace of post-war Western Europe, I had a somewhat, at the time, I would say, postmodern view of the world. And while seeing the dangers of globalization for democracy, I certainly underestimated the importance of being part of a well-defined community that interposes itself between the world and the individual. But at the United Nations, working on stabilizing countries that we often patronizingly call fragile states, I became acutely aware that indeed that familiar shell of a nation is very important for human beings. And I have come to the conclusion that societies are indeed fragile, and that before we address the question of democracy, we have in a way to address the question of society, what binds human beings together. And that if you don't have that, democracy is in a very precarious shape. But that was not so visible 30 years ago. In the last 30 years, since I wrote the book, that crisis of society has become more visible, as the tension has only grown between the urge to belong and to be part of a collective vision on the one hand, and a dominant ideology that celebrates the agency of the individual. That was a kind of intoxicating mood, I would say, that we had in 1989, when we felt that every human being was the master of her or his own future. But the more globalized the world becomes, and I'm not, and you mentioned the economy, and certainly the economy is a big part of globalization. But globalization is not just the movement of goods and capital. It's also the movement of people and ideas. I think the more we live in that globalized, borderless world at some level, the more we have the desire for communities with clear boundaries in which we are rooted. And the 30 years that have elapsed since I wrote my first book now give us the possibility to have a much better idea of the very powerful forces that were unleashed by the end of the Cold War. And it also gives us a better sense of what we did wrong. And on top of that, during those 30 years, two epoch-making events have happened. The first is the invention of the internet. It transformed societies, in my view, as profoundly as the invention of the printing press did 5 centuries ago, but it also redistributes power and wealth in a way that is comparable to what the Industrial Revolution did 2 centuries ago. So to understand its impact, we have to think of the revolution of the printing press and the Industrial Revolution happening all at once. This is a huge shock. That's the first event. And we are just beginning to understand its implications. The second event is, of course, the emergence of China. In China, in 1989, China, it was the repression in Tiananmen, the country that crushed its people, but it has now emerged as a kind of alternative model in the world. And so what is extraordinarily interesting, in my view, and important, is that both events give more urgency to the questions I raised about the end of the Cold War. And so my book is an attempt to weave together those different strands. And I will, to organize a bit my thought, I will talk first about the consequences of the misplaced post-1989 triumphalism. Then I will address the question of the age of data, then the China model. And then I would like at the end to reflect on what it means for our future. Haven't yet started that new book that Jean-Marc wants me to write, and I am very well aware that what I say in the present book is just indications. It's not fully fledged and developed answers, and I think it's very hard. Things are moving so quickly to have the definitive answers, but I'll try to indicate some directions in this presentation. So first, the 1989 triumphalism. We mistook the collapse of an exhausted regime, the Soviet Union, for the triumph of democracy. And that has had very serious consequences because I believe that we needed a real refoundation, so to speak, but we did not do it. And we looked in many ways backward. Now, with the war in Ukraine, there is much talk about the wisdom or bad idea that NATO enlargement was. I think the issue is much broader than NATO enlargement. It's about the way we looked at Russia and whether we understood that for Russia, the shock of losing its empire, its imperial dimension, was a massive shock. I mean, when you think of the shocks that for the Latin Kingdom, for France, the loss of empires, which were not contiguous empires, was. And in the case of Russia, the identity of Russia over the centuries had developed about, with the notion of an imperial dimension. So it was an enormous shock. And certainly, we treated Russia much better than Germany was treated after World War I. There's no question about that. And those who say that we humiliated Russia and all that is probably, it's excessive. But we certainly did not treat Russia the way, let's say, Germany was included in the Western world. They were after World War II. And I think there is probably that's our feeling. Now, of course, West Germany was included in the Western world because it was part of resisting the risk of domination by the Soviet Union in Europe, and there were very practical, immediate reasons. But whatever the reasons, the difference is there, and I think it has big implications because it meant that Russia, in a way, was a kind of second-class citizen of the Western world. And today we are paying a bit for that, and that's a big question. I think we look backward also in some ways when we made very serious progress with the European Union. And I'm very happy to speak in Brussels today from a distance because with all the questions I have on some aspects of the European Union, I think it's one of the most promising laboratories, so to speak, of the future of institutions. And I'm a very committed European. But I think that when we look at what we did, much was about, in a way, the internal dynamics of Europe. The fear that a unified Germany would be too dominant, and so it had to be tied within Europe, and that was the creation of the euro, which was a massive progress. I don't want to minimize it, but at the same time, I think that was looking backward in the sense that it was as if the main project of the European Union was still to prevent war between its members, which indeed is a fantastic achievement of the European enterprise. But I think we should have looked beyond that, because what is at stake today, what was at stake after 1989, is that Europe had ceased to be, in a way, the center of geopolitics. Now with Ukraine, maybe it's becoming a bit again a center of geopolitics. But certainly for the last 30 years, it could enjoy being on the margin of geopolitics. It was not the central player. And so the question for the Europeans was to define their relationship with the rest of the world. And how, in a world that was moving quickly, and I mentioned already the emergence of China, how the Europeans would position themselves. And they've done a lot of things, and I don't want to underestimate what has been done. But I think this was not seen as the key issue. And in some ways, it is a key issue. And then, of course, the most fundamental problem of all was that our own societies had lost an enemy, and they did not reflect on the values that could bind them together. The consumer replaced the citizen, and the value not just of goods on the market, but of everything, from political programs to ideas, was determined by success. Success of reputation, and that created this notion of elite, this word elite, which I think is a very dangerous word because it lumps together very different ways of living one's life. Jean-Marc Coicaud alluded to an idea that for me is absolutely key, the notion that there are different orders in your life. And when we say elite, we put in a way in the same bag the entrepreneur who has built a multi-billion-dollar business, which is fine, which is very good for the growth of the world, and the monk who has achieved a sort of perfection in his life. And they are two very different people. But the dominant ideology was the ideology of success. And that was well in tune with the notion that individual agency is the be-all and the end-all. And so the balance between the collective dimension of our lives and the individual dimension was lost. And that balance has been key to the success of the Western world, because indeed, without that empowerment of the individual, we would not have seen the enormous transformation and positive transformation that we have witnessed over the last few centuries. But at the same time, it cannot just be about the empowerment of the individual. It has to be about something more. It has to be about something that goes beyond us, and that is the collective. And we see today how the trust in collective institutions has collapsed, reflecting a trust in the very idea of representation. And that brings me to my second point, the crisis of politics. The left was the first victim of that new perception, because every government, every public institution was suddenly suspected of being just a kind of slightly improved version of the Soviet Union. There was a general distrust of public institutions. But I think the problem runs deeper. What is the space of our solidarities in a globalized world? If no community is self-evident, the ethical dimension of the left is challenged. Do we have to show solidarity to the people who are infinitely poorer than we are beyond our own borders? Do we have to show solidarity first within our borders? These are basic but fundamental questions that and they have a very concrete consequence for, let's say, leftist politics. And we are seeing it in the recent French election. Do you see the competition of the outside world as a threat to the solidarity among the French? And so the nationalist agenda lurks behind that question of the space of our solidarities. And if the left then finds as a solution just to be a slightly more equitable manager of the market, that is not quite enough, as we see with the collapse of, not in Germany, I must say, but in many countries with the collapse of sort of Blairist left. And the right side of politics thought that the triumph of the market was a vindication of its doctrine. But in a way, that was a very short-sighted view, because it failed to see that that triumph spelled the death of traditional politics. Because if the truth is in just the market, actually, the role of the state is just to have a competition authority, an independent central bank, and a few structures that allow for the fair play between the various economic actors. But the notion of a collective political program, once that has been achieved, loses its attraction. And so in the end, I think both left and right have had to fight back on the terrain of national values. I've mentioned it for the left, but I think it has become also very evident for the right. And that's where between the right and the extreme right connections have developed, because politics have become less and less a battle about programs, because fundamentally people are skeptical about programs. In some way, they have good reasons to be, because no country, even the most powerful, can really, you look at China, China is worried about the economic context beyond the borders of China. The United States is watching Europe. If there is an economic crisis in Europe, this will hurt the American economy. The biggest countries in the world know that they are not fully their own masters. And so the skepticism about a national response has some objective reasons. But on top of that, I would say that the new politics is about symbols rather than realities. It is neither a discussion of ideas nor a negotiation of interest. And the shared space of deliberations tends to disappear. The disillusion with national political programs opens the way for political entrepreneurs who offer the promise of an identity as a substitute, in a way, for the undelivered promise of change. And that brings me to my third point, actually, which is the age of data. Because what is very interesting here is that the advent of the age of data is a formidable accelerator of history, and the crisis of politics that I have just described is compounded by the emergence of the powerful virtual communities of the internet, which compete with territorial communities, eroding the common ground without which an open society cannot prosper. And that's important because in my first book and in a lot of thinking, the main issue was just how can a limited territorial community manage a collective destiny of a country while there are so many factors that are beyond its control. And so you see the need for a sort of global cooperation, and the case is compelling. But this is further complicated by this development of the virtual communities, which can be as strong, sometimes stronger than territorial communities, because the bonds that bring them together are the bonds of similarity. And so there is nothing stronger than a sort of narcissistic vision where you meet with people who are just like you. And so it's a self-reinforcing loop, so to speak, that we see in those communities. And when you live in such communities of choice, tolerance, compromise are no longer needed, because you are with people who just think like you. And in a way, the public space of democracy, the public space that makes a strong society, is strong only if you meet people. It's the beauty of happenstance, so to speak, and serendipity. It's only strong if you meet people who are different from you, if you are forced to meet them, if you go to the market and you have people who are very different from you. That's, in a way, that's the heart of of a vibrant society, is that differences of the communities that are not just communities of choices. But the revolution of data doesn't change only the conditions under which communities are shaped. It redefines, in my view, the foundations of legitimacy and threatens the traditional forms of representations. It transforms the processes through which knowledge is created and disseminated. It displaces power by creating new centers of power and wealth. And all that, instead of unfolding over several centuries, like the previous revolutions I had alluded to, is transforming the world over a few decades. I could develop each of these elements. Maybe in the question and answer, we will go deeper on that. But, let us just note, for instance, that in a society where when you buy a product, you give your opinion on the product, and that's useful, actually, to see with that washing machine or whether it works or not, and you look at the critique, and when you are on your Facebook page, you like or you don't. There is this impression that at every second of our life we can give our opinion. So the notion of a representative who will have his own views, who will not always think just like you over the few years he will be your representative, it looks almost quaint. It looks archaic. You would want a kind, the whole push is for a kind of day-to-day, I don't think it's democracy, but a sort of day-to-day possibility of giving one's opinion. And so the legitimacy of representative is deeply attacked. And the same applies to knowledge. When you generate every day through your post, you think you generate knowledge. It's often very far from knowledge, but you are a creator of information or pseudo information. And so this means that all human relations are relationship to power, relationship to knowledge are radically changed. And in the Western world, we have so far looked at that revolution through the traditional prism of privacy and the protection of the individual, which is perfectly logical in an age that puts the individual as the ultimate value, or as an extension of the debate on the regulation of media. And I am not questioning that these are very important issues, but I think that the age of data raises questions that go far beyond that. Each of us now, at every second, generates data, and the exponential growth of data can be managed only through algorithms. We are creating a new world in which the power is with the entities that manage the data we generate. That is the new capital. It's the data. And in our market economies, they are the giant data companies whose profits come from advertising revenues generated by clicks. And all studies show that sharp, edgy opinions generate more clicks than nuance. If you say on the one hand, on the other hand, that's not very exciting. And so the more excessive, the more attractive. And in that sense, and I conclude this short analysis on data, in that sense, the crisis of politics and the internet revolution reinforce each other. The closed communities that I described in the crisis of politics, they are reinforced by the dynamics of the age of data. Now, in front of that, and that's my next point, we have China. In China, the Communist Party is the ultimate master of data. And it wants to use them in a radically different way from the Western giants of the internet. Social credit system is a kind of, the social credit system is a kind of preventative dictatorship. We see for the moment the dark side of China, the repression, the Uyghur, etc. But I think what China is aiming at is something that would go beyond Orwell, that actually would be closer to Aldous Huxley with his happiness pills. It's the idea that you could, through the management of data, create a kind of bubble of happiness. where people would be like the dog of the La Fontaine, La Fontaine, you know, who is with a wolf and who meets a wolf, and he says he doesn't feel his color. He's a happy dog, well fed. That's in a way the ideal that maybe China would like to achieve. I don't know if it will. And now let me turn for the end of this presentation to the future. To the future. I think we are really at a fork in the road. We may move towards an increasingly violent and fragmented world in which the common ground that binds individuals and societies become ever more precarious, or alternatively, and in the long term, it may be a more likely scenario, we may all be put in into a kind of stupor of contentment that dissolves controversy and debate, but allows us to live in peace. The first choice, the first branch of the fork, it leads to ever-increasing violence and war. After the war in Ukraine started, French commentators called my book prescient because I described the destruction of society in Russia and its brutal violence, which provides the context for what we now see happening in Ukraine. I also characterized the war in Syria as emblematic of our time, with the systematic violation of basic international humanitarian law norms. And in some ways, the Ukraine war very much looks like the Syria war. The point I make in my book is that there is a strong connection between the violence within society and the violence between countries, and that the wars of the 21st century may reflect that fact. At one end of the spectrum, there is the individualized violence, and terrorism is the extreme, what I call the selfie of violence, because it doesn't further a political project, but it gives an identity to the terrorist, which takes advantage of the extreme weakness of our societies. And at the other end, there is the massive violence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which reflects an ethno-nationalism of political entrepreneurs, in which society deprived of shared values finds its identity in the act of exterminating an imaginary, a mythical enemy. So that's a possible future, fragmenting world, and it's a catastrophic future, of course, if it was to develop that way, especially in the age of weapons of mass destruction. I think the alternative choice is the disappearance of conflict, but also of debate. And what China would like to achieve through what I just call preventative dictatorship. By that, I mean that in our ever more dysfunctional, fragmented, and conflicted societies, there's a longing for a kind of Chinese harmony, stability, tranquility, which may well be managed by the state, but produces a more peaceful society. This is certainly not the China of today, as I said, but this is the model that China would like to achieve. And I wonder whether that aspiration is not shared, will not be increasingly shared in parts of the Western world, because it's reinforced by the fragmentation of the world in the hateful, closed communities and its international replication, the brutal shock of interstate war as we see in Ukraine. So there is indeed an increasing risk that in societies exhausted by permanent conflict, the temptation will increase to suppress debate so as to suppress conflict within societies and between countries. And when you see the development of the politically correct in the United States, where you try to legislate the coexistence between communities, you can see, in a way, that temptation beginning to surface. Obviously, for me, the two branches of the fork are equally unacceptable. I dread a world slipping into ever more violent conflict, but I don't want a world in which the only path to peace is the bland sleep of conformity. And that's, in a way, why I wrote that book, that I want to, a way that allows us to live in societies where money and success are not the ultimate yardstick, which makes life unbearable in a society where you can only be a winner or a loser whose dignity is denied. And so the unidimensional society of success is a country of a pluralist society. So what is to be done? I see that there is not much time left for the answers, and maybe that's a trick I pulled on you. But I will say a few words. And my first point is that there are answers that, in my view, are not the real answers. There's much talk today about direct democracy as a response to the crisis of representation. And I think in some local situations it can help. I think in many situations, because the essence of democracy is about deliberation, and you cannot deliberate when you are millions, I think it misses the essence of the crisis. I think the notion of democracy by lots, which is also being pushed, it can address some issues because it can restore the diversity that is needed to restore trust. But it cannot be, again, the full answer. And democracy by lots can mean assemblies that can be manipulated quite easily. So there are some answers that are fashionable today, which we need to experiment on a small scale, but that are not the full answers. At the core, I see the need for truly pluralist societies that acknowledge, as Isaiah Berlin did, that there are competing good values, equally legitimate, and that different societies have different trade-offs, for instance, between the collective and the individual. There are many ways, and certainly some societies put more emphasis on the individual, some more on the collective, and that is fine. And I think we have to accept that this is the product of history, and that each society has its own history, and the notion that there would be one uniform model makes no sense. We must, through education, accept that a good society is a society which accepts that there are different paths to good life. As I said, the billionaire entrepreneur and the humble monk, the scientist and the artist, they all have a dream. They all enrich society, and they all have their own legitimacy. And so I think education is probably one of the key issues of the coming years. But coming to the question of legitimacy, today we reduce legitimacy to electoral success, itself a variant of market success or financial success. We need to accept that there are competing sources of legitimacy. That's another aspect of pluralism. And we need to organize their coexistence. Of course, there is the legitimacy of elections, and we see the importance of being able to fire leaders that we think have not done a good job. But we have to recognize that there are other legitimacies, that the legitimacy of election. There's a legitimacy of knowledge, and the distinction between the two is often blurred. And my book suggests that we must change that and better organize the relationship between competing legitimacies. And this is all the more important as knowledge and expertise are growing exponentially. If we want to have some control over the new power of data, whether it is the Communist Party of China or giant US data companies, we need to imagine new institutions that will have the expertise to control the new sources of power, to monitor algorithm, and to shed more light on their political implications. And then the political institutions can decide on the basis of that informed judgment where they put the balance. But we need that expertise to balance this new power. And so clarifying the relationship between politics and science will also help illuminate, in my view, one of the most important debates of our time, climate policy. The climate debate has the potential to restructure politics the way the social question did in the past 2 centuries. But for that to happen, the awareness of the possibility of climate catastrophe has to move from dire predictions to a debate on the degree of risk a society is willing to accept and the trade-off that implies. And when I use this word risk, I think it's a key concept because risk is at the heart of the balance between the collective and the individual. If we say zero risk, we mean a society where the individual is the be-all and the end-all. The choice is what kind of risk, what amount of risk are we prepared to tolerate? And that's not a scientific question, it's a political question. So risk, and last but not least, restoring legitimacy is also about building an effective ladder of institutions that connect the local to the global. And in Brussels, with the European Union, certainly you are well placed to think about that. We have been used to thinking along the lines of the traditional federal model as a solution. But the growing skepticism about big structures that can make big mistakes. Imagine we had a president of Europe elected, directly elected, and we had some European Trump. That would not be a huge progress. I think this question, this skepticism about big structures and the competition of virtual communities really force a rethink of that model. The institution of the future, they will articulate different types of legitimacy, and they will accept complexity and flexibility as a strength rather than a weakness. And that will not follow, therefore, the traditional federal model. And so in my book, I look at European institutions as an example, but not necessarily a universal model, because again, we have to think of each continent, each country with its own history. And so to conclude, I would say that in the end, what is at stake is the possibility of societies that welcome and manage the unpredictability of change rather than aim for a static reproduction of the past, that embrace differences rather than suppress them, that create a genuine common ground rather than retreat in the coexistence of self-contained communities, narcissistic communities. So that's, I've been a little too long, I apologize for that, but these are some of the themes of my book, and I'll stop there. Happy to take questions.
Many thanks, Professor. We are now going to Sabrina, but just as a comment, some of your last point are very much one of the motivation between what we are doing. Here in the European Parliament Research Service, what we are trying to do is precisely to increase the expertise, and we have done so dramatically over the last years. It's not common in Parliament to invest that much in building an independent expertise, precisely because we want to harness the flow of data. And this is not only by producing text, but also by checking, this is the role of library and knowledge services, that the pluralistic sources available are really used by the member and the people working with them, so that they can build on different ways of thinking and not just get the feedback from their own community. Risk also have become very central in a way of analysis of the present, future, and midterm future. And with many discovery that in the past we were not very good at it in the European Union, and that risk, with the description you made, balance between the individual and the collective, was sometimes just seen as a kind of variable d'ajustement, something on the margin, something not worth being taken that much into policy making. Now it has become much more central. We just produced last week 15 risk analysis that is very different from what is being done in the private sector, which call them future shock, which are happening now for many of them. But without further ado, I want to introduce Sabrina, who is one of those people trying to make the economic globalization work, trying to continue build cooperation between very different political entities with very different interests, very different worldviews, and to ask her from her point of view and from her practice in G20, G7, what is her reading of this very consistent narrative you made from the crisis of community to the crisis of politics and to the crisis of global cooperation. So Sabrina is not only a very important person in the preparation of those meetings in the OECD, but also a pure Franco-German product, a German citizen. She has served in very top position in the French system, in the Secrétariat Général à la Défense Nationale. So this is one of the key organs of the Prime Minister, not only to prepare for the defense of the country, but also to assess large risk and potential threats for the future. And then she has also been, of course, a very important research colleague in the LSE, where she has almost shifted to the academy, but hopefully for the OECD at least, she's with them. So Sabrina, floor is yours from your point of view, and maybe you can explain what you're doing daily. What is your reading as a practitioner of this very interesting view of where we stand and where we may go?
Thank you so much, dear Frank, for these very kind words. And thank you also, Professor Guéhenno, for your explanations, and Professor Coicaud for your views. I try to complement your perspective from maybe, from my background. And in the interest of time, I will go straight to the point. Just let me mention that I very much enjoyed reading Professor Guéhenno's book. I think also it is very rich. I think it is very timely, and it pertinently addresses the insufficiencies and challenges that our society as a whole faces, but also we as individual citizens of this society. So I think it ticks a lot of the right boxes, and even when I finished the book, for me it wasn't yet finished, because then I thought, okay, now I have enough food for thought, and I would like to join Jean-Marc in encouraging Professor Guéhenno to think about the second version of this book. So yeah, we talked about globalization. Professor Guéhenno, I would like to revert to your remarks. Let me start right at the beginning, for example, with the subtitle of your book, which is in English, From Globalization to the Fragmentation of the World, which sounds very intriguing to me, but maybe, if you allow, almost a bit provocative for somebody who works on economic globalization and who works in an international organization who deals with economic integration. I think so. It's a little bit provocative because while globalization carries an array of meanings among different disciplines, people usually tend to think that the world has evolved from isolated countries to a more interconnected and more interwoven, more interdependent world on issues such as trade, investment, labor, banking, but also the movement of people you mentioned, the movement of ideas, goods and services as well. And we see that and benefit from that every day. So consequently, I would assume that the world has actually moved into the opposite direction, from fragmentation to globalization. And I would like to have your view on that. And I would also like to ask you, how would you explain to economic people this ostensibly perceived contradiction, even going beyond the economic dimension? I don't know if I go on or if we go to the response straight away, or I just go on and then maybe we collect.
Maybe you go on, Sabrina, with a few of your questions. This is a good introduction to our question section, and we leave then Professor Guéhenno reply, and then we engage with the people online. We don't have that much time, but thank you for putting in the middle of the table this very important question, obviously.
I have more thoughts and questions to share with you, actually, because I would like to come to the very important issue of trust that Professor Guéhenno mentioned. in your book, Professor Guéhenno, you speak about the lost trust in political institutions, and that the links that used to connect the representatives and those who are represented have become weak and even broken. And we know that trust, and you describe it as integral and important for society and also for social cohesion. So a Gallup study found that only 51%, so out of two, of citizens trusted their government in OECD countries in 2020. And there is a growing concern about a crisis in public trust, a trust deficit. You describe this very well in your book. And that this is contributing, as you said, also among other things, for support for extreme political views, increasing public discontent. And looking now at France and the presidential elections just a couple of days ago, we see that in France, the voting abstention has continually increased since from 16% in 2007 to 28% this year, 2022. So do you think this development will continue in France and maybe beyond, as we see the same phenomena also in other countries? And what do you think would be the ingredients that allow for a rapprochement between the so-called elite, if we want to revert back to the term, and the citizens that they seek to govern? So another point that I found interesting is the place or the discussion in your book about Europe and which kind of Europe we want or we're seeking to. We have seen in the last months Europe being marginalized by the submarine deal that was made at the expense of France, and we can also say France equals Europe in that case. In a recent article in the Foreign Affairs, Timothy Snyder argues that Ukraine could actually be a chance for democratic renewal. He writes that in order to stop this war, the EU must continue the road it has chosen of economic sanctions, but that we must go beyond that, that we must assert that the European Union is capable of moral, political, and intellectual renewal. And we could assume that Europe's future will be decided in Ukraine. Do you share that there is a window of opportunity that Europe may or will regain its strategic importance on the international scene? And finally, one thing I like very much about your book, or at the end you write, you use the metaphor of logiciel, of software. You write that the 21st century is like the first version of an insufficiently tested software, and it reveals new flaws every day. We have spoken about that. And in order to stay within the computer language, I would like to ask or to spark thoughts about how do you think could look like an update of that flawed software to make it more user-friendly for the second part of the 21st century? Or how would look like, in your view, an efficient firewall that makes the software less vulnerable but more stable to protect us users from major disruptions? I think this is a very broad question, but maybe it may become part of your second book, and maybe the second part of the 21st century. Let's see. But yeah, this, in interest of time, were very briefly my thoughts. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sabrina. So quite a lot of work for you, Professor Guéhenno. Globalization, economic versus the non-economic, how reconcile these apparently contradictory dimension. Trust, a new start for Europe with the Ukraine crisis, a window of opportunity for something new, an update of the globalization logiciel or software, or at least kind of build a firewall around it to protect it. So floor is
Okay.
yours, and then we will continue, if you agree, with questions from our panelists. We are more than 60, we are close to 60 on line still, and we will still have a few minutes after your brief reply to Sabrina. Thank you, Sabrina.
Well, thank you for your excellent questions. I'll try to be brief to give time for questions from the audience. Fragmentation and globalization. I don't think that we are going to move toward a totally fragmented world, and I think that would be actually catastrophic on all counts, intellectually, economically. I mean, from any angle, we don't want that. What I think is that the tension between a world that will continue to be globalized and the need for boundaries, for having an horizon in a community, that tension is going to remain, and that the key question is how you manage it. If you ignore it, you ignore it at your own peril. And my book is in a way try to point at the perils and outline some of the possible answers, which brings me to your second question of trust. And indeed, the question of trust is not going to go away. When you look at, you referred to the election, actually, the strongest vote for Macron was among older people. So the new generations, they may not necessarily be more trustful, on the contrary, of institutions. So this is a wake-up call for the future. How do we address that? My view is that it has to be a bottom-up process, that it is probably through the local that we have a better chance of restoring a measure of a sense of the collective. What is interesting today is that while the traditional parties are in crisis, apart from the new extremists, there's also a very lively scene in terms of one-issue NGOs, organizations that focus on climate, that focus on gender, on a variety of important issues. But a society is about, again, trade-off between competing issues. And so what we need is to connect those communities, those one-issue communities, to something broader than one issue. And I think probably that needs to be done at the local level. And that's why the ladder from the local to the global, in my view, is so important. But if we want to revitalize democracy, it's probably at the level of cities and their periphery that you need to do that. And you see in the Le Pen vote, there are studies that show that these parts of France that are poorly connected are the ones that are most likely to vote for Le Pen. So you need that combination of focus on the local community and connecting that local community to broader issues. And you probably do it through the issue-based organizations. But there are good issues and the bad issues, so to speak. But that's a longer debate. Ukraine. I have to be honest, I was surprised, as certainly Putin was, by the strength of the European reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. And I agree with Timothy Snyder that there is something good there. What I'm not sure of is that so far there hasn't been much sacrifice. That this is everybody, it's not too expensive to have a yellow and blue ribbon, but if tomorrow with sanctions on energy and all that, the economic and social consequences for the Europeans of supporting Ukraine become more visible and more painful, that solidarity and that strategic dimension of Europe will be tested, because it's one thing to ask for sacrifice, but then it calls into question the national compact. It's harder for a poor to make a sacrifice than a rich person. So there are all sorts of issues down the road as the crisis deepens and as the economic consequences of the crisis develop, that where Europe will have to show its mettle. And I hope it will, but it is not yet guaranteed. And I think we need to think about that. Your last question, update on software. I think what on the software, I think, you know, you have software, I mean, to continue with the image, you have software which are open architectures and software which are closed architectures. And we need to move more and more towards structures that are open architectures, that allow for trial and error, and that allow for adjustments. Because I think if we try to find the answer, and it's back to my to the issue of pluralism, if we try to find the answer, we will fail, and it's very dangerous. It's better to organize ourselves so that different answers can be tested. Now, of course, there are trade-offs, and well, you are an economist, and we see, for instance, in trade, in economic exchange, the importance of having norms that help all the parts to connect. Without those norms, it is the fragmentation that we don't want. So it's easier said than done to say we need to try to have various answers, and at the same time we need to have a floor of shared norms, and that balance between the floor of shared norms and the diversity of various responses, that is something that needs to be negotiated. But as you say, one could write a whole book on that. So I will stop there.
Two questions, if you allow, Professor. The first is on corruption and the naming and shaming of corruption. Corruption has been massive in so many countries experiencing globalization. It has turned many attempts on democratization into a mockery of democracy, with the pseudo-elite or the political entrepreneur responsible for corruption not requested to accountability by the Western country, the international organization, the UN, or at least not so much. So is there something here that could be fixed for the future, at least recognized for the past? What is your view on this corruption as a destruction of the political legitimacy in many countries experiencing modernization at the same time?
Yes, no, I think corruption is in a way a reflection of the dominance of the ideology of success and money, because it's a continuous chase, so to speak, where you pass laws, you sign the treaty, the OECD convention, etc. But at the same time, the ethos is about making money within a framework of laws, but the laws are continuously catching up with the cleverness of lawyers and who get around the laws. And so I think the issue of corruption is as much a cultural issue as a legal issue, and you have to treat it on both counts. But it's also an issue where certainly the norms that I was mentioning a few moments ago, this is something that needs to be developed. And we see, for instance, it's interesting with China, which has, of course, it's not party to the OECD convention, obviously, but it is in some working groups. And you can see that China, which has major investments in Africa, it has a certain interest in the stability of those countries. And so I think we need to have a dialogue on those issues. And this is typically the kind of issue where we have to try to develop universal norms.
A question maybe more to the diplomat than to the writer of the book. Following your first statement on the disappointment with 1989, is there still a chance? And then what would be the roadmap to finally bring Russia into a democratic space? Because obviously not all the country, not all the people support the current regime and its option. So beyond resisting to the brutality, is there a roadmap parallel to resistance to allow for Russia and the Russian people to find at a point, again, a place in a democratic space?
I think it's Brzezinski who said that to be a democracy, Russia has to cease being an empire. And certainly this is a very, very strong point. I think, when coming back to what I said earlier, I think for Russia to become a democracy, for instance, it has to come to terms with its past, which Germany did very courageously after World War II, and which has not happened at all in Russia. Yes, there are organizations that actually now are being dismantled, like Memorial, a wonderful organization that have tried to gather information and to help Russia come to terms with its past. But I think so long as that does not happen, it's very difficult for Russia to have the roots that will allow it to have the shared values that are the foundation of a democracy. So for me, that's one of the starting points. I think that as we, to be very practical, as we sanction Russia, we must try as much as possible not to stop the flow of people. Of course, there are security considerations, and we don't want Russian spies or a variety of operatives to sabotage our countries, clearly. But I think it's very important to keep that human connection, because Russia is really a tale of two countries, with an hinterland that is still very poor, very poorly informed, and cities that may not be democratic, that have, as I say in my book, they have embraced Louis Vuitton as a new flag rather than really democracy, but that have this connection with the rest of the world. And I think this is an important part of Russia. So human connections and accepting one's past will be necessary steps. But it's only the Russians that can do it. We can help them by connecting with them at a human level, but it will not be imposed by us. And I fear, to be honest, that before it gets better, it may get worse, actually.
Two other 1 minute question. According to you, what has happened in a few Arab countries, especially Egypt, after the attempt of the Arab Spring, does it represent your view of this renouncement to democratic debate and search for stability, harmony, which comes together with a form of dictatorship? So has this kind of Chinese model of harmony, stability, zero debate won in Egypt and in other Arab states where there was the expectation of a democratic transition?
I think in Egypt is more the purely repressive model that is in play at the moment. But I think in the developing world, of course, the combination of authoritarian regime plus economic development is extremely attractive, and many countries would want to replicate that model. Now, whether they can, I mean, it links to the question of corruption. And you see, even in China, the fight against corruption is often politically motivated, but it's also identified probably by the regime as a potential serious threat to the development of the country. I think in Egypt, you don't have that economic much economic development compared to what you have in China, certainly. And to be honest, with the Ukraine crisis, the shock for countries which do not export oil but import wheat is going to be massive. And so I think it would be really important, actually, for the European Union, if it wants countries to be more supportive of the principle of that you don't aggress a country. It's very important for the European Union to think about that and of mechanisms to alleviate the shock that is coming on a number of countries because of the Ukraine war.
A last one, a little bit on the line of another commentator of Fukuyama, that was Huntington. How do you see the role of religion in globalization or deglobalization? Of course, it's in the book, but for the reader or the tented reader, do you have a little bit of teasing on that so that they jump into the book?
Well, I think, religion can be used by identity entrepreneurs, and that's what it is. But it's you have to scratch the surface, and you see, for instance, in the radical dimension of religion is often promoted by people who are not very religious themselves, who have been petty criminals, who have. So it's a way to, on the market, it's a way to gain an identity rather than a way to I don't think it's deeply religious, to be clear. I am more of the view in that sense of Olivier Roy than of Gilles Kepel. I think the complexity of the issue, and that's where I disagree with Huntington, is that today religion is often disconnected from culture, and so it's part of the fragmentation of the society. Which is inevitable in societies where there is more fluidity, where there are more diverse communities, and so there is not a dominant culture, which creates new challenges for religion. But as you say, one could write a whole book on that again.
Last word, le mot de la fin, maybe starting by Sabrina to give a final pitch to the people still attending. We're still around 50 to read the book. A last thing you can promise when a reader reads the book to discover.
Yes, one thing, thank you. One thing I can assure is that the reader will not be disappointed. As I said at the beginning, it's a very pertinent book for our own reflection in which world we live, in which world we want to live. That it's very interesting to read the book itself because of it brings together cultural views, it brings together societal views, but also it puts a question mark on the relationship between individualisme contre la collectivité. And yeah, as I said, I can't wait for the second version of the book.
Professor Coicaud, any final comment, any final advice to the reader, but to read the book?
Paul, as Mr. Guéhenno mentioned, the book also tells us that the phone has been ringing for quite a while. Nobody has been answering the phone. and therefore we continue to, in a way, we have continued to sleepwalking. And so the key question that the book is asking is what we have been able to realize in terms of democratic values. Is it the best we can do? And hopefully it's not the case, because if it is the best we can do, we are more or less doomed. And therefore, we have really to work very hard to try to do a better job for the way forward.
Read the book to know how we could better do, and then start working and writing. I would just say to readers, and there are many in the library that have seen the book among the new acquisition, this is one of those rare books that brings together a complete narrative from individual, from the ethic, the cultural dimension of the individual, sociology, thinking about sociology, politics and political science, geopolitics, as Jean-Marc pointed out, international institutionalism, all those different elements are together and very closely knitted together. And this makes this book a rare book in the world of current scholarship, where we have a silo approach many times, a silo structure, where the people discussing inequality are not discussing geopolitics, where the people discussing how the individual relate to his or her own ethic are not discussing the global sphere and the global interaction. So in this context, it's really a book that brings together many threads of our time and of our future together, and that is maybe a model of a new type of writing, where with a mastery of different disciplines, at the end, you make sense for the individual, the collectivity, institutions like the nation state, institutions like those helping the nation states to do their work, and the international institutions. So really a textbook for the individual as well as for the UN Secretary General. So something that is really worth reading for all. Many thanks, Professor Guéhenno. Many thanks, Professor Coicaud. Many thanks, Sabrina from the OECD, to have been present in this 1 hour and a half book talk, like we like to have here in the European Parliamentary Research Service. And we will stay in touch, because the discussion is worth when it is continued, and we'll have plenty of occasion to see if our current assessment is proving right or wrong, and if we start going back into the right direction here and there. So many thanks to all our participants for the excellent question and your tour du monde from Russia to China to Egypt and to the many countries facing corruption and difficulty with the current stage of globalization. Merci à tous, c'était formidable et merci de nous avoir offert, après la fin de la démocratie, une autre lecture qui a vraiment de quoi nous faire réfléchir.
Merci. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup à vous tous. Merci.
Merci.